You know, sometimes I just think we're all Irish. It's the way it is. You probably know the story about Alfred Nobel, the originator of the Nobel Peace Prize. When his brother died, Nobel got a copy of the newspaper to see what was said about his brother. He was shocked to discover that a dreadful error had been made. The paper had confused him with his brother. And the obituary he was reading was his own. As a young man, Alfred Nobel had been involved in the invention of dynamite, and his premature obituary elaborated on the terrible death and destruction that this powerful force had brought to the world. Nobel was devastated. He wanted to be known as a man of peace, and he quickly realized that if his obituary was to be rewritten, he would have to do it himself by changing the nature of his own life. And so Alfred Nobel did just that, and I dare say that he is better known today for his contribution to peace rather than for any other thing he did in his life. It's the beginning of Advent. Today we lit the candle of peace. Our text comes to us from Isaiah in the 2nd chapter. You need to know something about the 1st chapter, though, before we move to that. And that is that in the 1st chapter, Isaiah rails against the rebellion of Israel, Israel's rebellion against God. He says, "Woe to a sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great. Stop bringing me offerings. Your incense is detestable to me." He's a realist, and his images are as graphic as the evening news. Your cities are burned with fire, he says. Think Benghazi. Zion is like a besieged city. Think Aleppo. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. Think Congress. It's all very contemporary and realistic. And then he says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And then in chapter 2, Isaiah moves from this glaringly realistic look at his contemporary nation through the punishment that will come to Israel, and he imagines a totally different time in the future. And this is what Jennifer read to us. In the last days, the mountain of God's temple will be established as the highest mountains, exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. This is little dinky Israel that we're talking about here. God will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. What is Isaiah? Crazy? What kind of a vision is this? I mean, he's got a very wild imagination. But this is a vision that continues to speak to us today. Isaiah's words, "They will beat their swords into plowshares," are carved into the wall across from the United Nations building. This image speaks to us from the future and continues to shape us. But how will God settle disputes? How will weapons of destruction be shaped into implements that nourish life and grow community? Walter Brueggemann, Hebrew Testament scholar, suggests that an entire worldview must change from what it is now to the biblical vision of God's ways in order for violence to cease. And note that there are two kinds of violence that Isaiah is preaching against. Economic violence within his nation, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow, and the military violence between nations. Beat your swords and spears, swords into plowshares, and spears into pruning hooks. And these two spheres of violence are connected by assumptions which often organize human society. And these characteristics are the worldview of which Brueggemann speaks. It's pretty straightforward. Violence first begins in the myth of scarcity. The myth of scarcity results in material deprivation for some people. It's the assumption that there isn't enough for everyone that makes for violence. That there isn't enough food, enough material goods, enough love. And if we believe that there isn't enough, then we have to compete for our resources. And competition for resources means that once we get them, we want to store them up. So, for fear of their being stolen, lost, or destroyed, which means that there are less resources available for those who have little to none. And even in our tremendously successful market-driven society, we're seeing the divide between wealth and poverty widen, with 1% of the population controlling almost 40% of the wealth. Not that there aren't other forces at work, there are. But largely, this is driven by the sense of scarcity, which results in material deprivation for a larger percent of people. But it doesn't end there. This myth of scarcity makes people suspicious of one another. Suspicion erodes trust, paranoia arises, and human connection breaks down. Thus, violence is more possible. Maybe you experience at work. Coworkers are seen as competitors, so the workplace becomes an arena of emotional and verbal violence. In the society at large, the haves and the have-nots are isolated from one another, making the have-nots feel frantic and desperate. And though the haves are in power, they are not the initiators of this arrangement. This is really important. It's not that those who have initiated this entire arrangement. It's a belief in the myth of scarcity that sets us in this position, so that even people with very little resort to violence, believing that there's not enough for them. Just witness what's the number? 509 killings in Chicago in 2015. These are desperate young men who have been convinced that the myth of scarcity is true, and the human connection between them has broken down, as it has between cities and suburbs and the rural poor. So you start with the myth of scarcity, you move to the breaking down of human connections, and then thirdly, desperate and frantic people begin to cry out in protest and in pain and anger and in rage. They feel as if they are unable to have any impact on their future. And then violence is almost assured in order to silence these cries of desperation. This is what has spawned the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, the shootings of young black men by police officers have gone viral on social media. This knowledge has spawned a movement. It's not that all lives don't matter. Of course all lives matter. It's crazy to think otherwise. But in this particular situation, the lot of black people has been ignored, and their voices haven't been heard. And the assumption of scarcity has materially deprived a people and disconnected them with the rest of society, motivating them to lift their voices in desperation. A few have responded violently, giving in to the assumptions of scarcity that drive our culture. But most are hoping that their voices will move the nation to hear their cries, that together we might imagine an other way of organizing ourselves. But Isaiah doesn't leave us there. Isaiah moves to this time in the future. There is hope, and he presents us with a hope for peace drawn from the biblical tradition. First, resources aren't scarce. This is God's creation. God has made a world in which there are sufficient resources for all. This is the assumption the prophet Isaiah is asking us to believe. The biblical record declares that there is enough. The slaves were wandering in the wilderness after escaping from Egypt to get manna for food. And even though they didn't like the way it tasted, and even though they weren't allowed to store it up for the next day, they were provided with enough. Jesus convinces a hungry crowd of 5,000 to share their resources with each other by the example of a young boy sharing his 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Where there is trust in the gospel, there is enough. Could swords be beaten into plowshares if we decided that our starting point was not scarcity, but the sense that there are sufficient resources for all? And then as a second movement as hope toward peace, Isaiah appeals to the biblical tradition of the covenant between God and God's people to mend the isolation in society. Isaiah says a few chapters later, "Is not the feast I want for you to share? Is not the feast I want for you to share your bread with the hungry and invite the homeless poor into your house?" And the book of Exodus declares, God is awesome. God takes no bribes, but executes justice for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And here's the kicker. Remember, you were once strangers in Egypt. You were once cut off from the resources of your country. So Isaiah has hope through the biblical tradition that we will restore connections between people. And lastly, Isaiah legitimizes speech and asks that all voices be heard. Do you remember when Moses was at the burning bush and he was called by God to go back into Egypt and free his brothers and sisters who were slaves there? God says, I heard the cries of your people, of my people. They had been crying out already, but the Pharaoh had been deaf to their cries. But God hears the cries and calls us to hear their voices and to help create a new reality for them. So how will we beat our swords into plowshares? Geez, I hate this part of the sermon. I don't know. It's a great vision. It calls us to rethink how it is that we live together as a people. But you know, my grandson, Gus, don't tell him I told you this story. He loves the musical Hamilton. And they bought a copy in their house and they play it a lot. He takes hip-hop dancing lessons, so he likes the music from Hamilton very much. But they started listening to it from the beginning, and so it's such a long show that they never make it all the way to the end. So one day, his mom said, why don't we start listening to it halfway through? That way we can hear it all the way to the end. And you know the story, Alexander Hamilton is rising to power, and Aaron Burr is also an important figure in the nation at this time. And so when you come to the end of the show, what happens is there's a duel, and Aaron Burr shoots Alexander Hamilton and kills him. And Gus fell apart. He just wept. Why? Why did that have to happen? Well, that's kind of how they did it in those days, Gus, his mom said. You know, they would have duels. But why? Why did they have to do that? Didn't they know they could use their words? I don't know how this is going to happen, but don't we know we can use our words? What do you think, Benjamin? Huh? Yeah. I know. It's so frustrating. But we have ways of understanding that can lead us down the path of peace. I don't know exactly how we're going to get there. But we're going to have to give up the myth of scarcity, which calls us to guard our resources, to trust in God's sufficiency, and share our resources. We're going to have to give up the idea of competition in which each are against all, and discover the ground of community in God's covenant with all people. We're going to have to give up the idea that silence will protect the status quo, and let all voices be heard to make the decisions that will move us ahead toward peace. Alfred Nobel realized that if his obituary was to be rewritten, he would have to do it himself by changing the nature of his life. And Isaiah is asking you and me and us to do the same thing. And with God's help, we can. Amen.